mercy. All right, so I get on the thing, it's got twice as much sag as it wants. How do I adjust it? Sag is tuned using what we call preload. Now, preload is the force we're putting on the spring. In other words, how much are we squeezing the spring? Now, shock absorbers will have some sort of easily accessible external weight adjustment. A high-performance shock absorber like this typically has a threaded collar, so I can make very small, fine adjustments. A lot of your street bikes will have a ramped collar that has a little cam-type mechanism with anywhere from 3 to 7 notches. Click, click, click. A little easier to do, but a much more coarse adjustment. What you're going to find is pretty much every motorcycle made is going to have a preload adjustment, even a little 250cc commuter bike. So why would they give a little basic bike like that adjustment? You got to think about where the weight is. Where's the rider sit? Well, towards the back of the bike, middle of the rear. Where is passengers, loads, and anything else going to add this bike go? Saddlebags, duffel bags, rider on the back. At or behind the rear axle, a lot of leverage going on here. So I have to have provision to adjust that on pretty much any kind of bike. Now, forks is a little bit tougher. A fork may or may not have an external adjuster. Your sport bike forks and some of your sport touring bikes will have some sort of knob or nut up here to turn to tension the spring inside there, but most don't, like this example here. And I'll show you a picture of this later on, but if I don't have an external way to tune preload, I have to take the cap off and alter the length of a spacer inside here or add one to it. Sometimes it's just sliding a few washers inside there, sometimes it's cutting a piece of aluminum or PVC pipe to set that distance inside there. So when we talk about preload, we're talking about how far the spring has moved from what we call its free length. So let's use the shock for the example here, it works a little bit better. If I give it my shock right here, and the spring I have on this thing, measured out free length, sitting on the workbench, it's 200 millimeters long. Once I've installed it on the shock, I'm at 185 millimeters. So for this example, I've placed 15 millimeters of preload on the spring. So let's go back to our sag here. For the sake of discussion, let's pretend that I measured 50 millimeters of sag, 2 inches, right? And for the sake of discussion, I'm going to go track day this bike. I want 25 millimeters of sag. So I got twice as much as I want, right? 50 millimeters, 2 inches, I want 1 inch. For the sake of discussion, we're dealing with that 100-pound spring that I talked about. 100 pounds of force moves it an inch. So humor me, be nice. Hey, it's almost Christmas, right? Let's pretend I weigh 200 pounds. So if I weigh 200 pounds and I stand on top of my 100-pound spring, how far is the spring going to move? 2 inches, right? 1 inch for every 100 pounds. But how far do I want it to move? I want it to move 1 inch, right? How much preload do I put on it? 1 inch, okay? Put 1 inch preload on it. Now, it's an oversimplified one-to-one example, but it helps drive the point home. What did I change? Did I change the rate of the spring? Nope. It's still a 100-pound shock spring. Once you manufacture the spring to a rate, it's always going to have that rate unless I physically alter the spring. Unless I cut off a coil or dip it in acid or do something to change the physical characteristics, always 100-pound spring. That preload simply used up the first 100 pounds of force on that spring. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So, sag and preload will play together. I gave you my example here. Typical preload number is 5 to 35 millimeters. Well, why such a wide range? It depends on the application. Sometimes you want more preload than others. Always got to have some, because I got to allow for that suspension component to re-extend into a bump, into a dip, right? If I measured my sag, and I found I had more sag than I wanted, and I had to use most or all of my available preload to adjust it, that suggests I need a stiffer spring, doesn't it? By the same token, if I'm setting up this bike for my daughter, and by the way, she's like 5 foot nothing, about 120 pounds, it's going to be too stiff for her. She's going to need a lighter spring or less preload. So that's what you look at. Look at how much preload it takes to get your sag, can you even get it, and how does that play together? Rule of thumb, by the way, is that a stiffer spring with less preload typically feels better and more comfortable to a rider than a softer spring with more preload. If we want to adjust the damping on our bike, we might have the opportunity to do this by virtue of what we call clickers. Clickers are a term that we've tagged on to external adjusters that may or may not be found on your forks or shocks. So in my first picture there, I got a picture of a fork, and we've got a screwdriver adjusting a little screw on the top middle of the fork. Screws on the top of the forks, rule of thumb, are for a rebound damping adjustment. So it's controlling how quickly that fork re-extends. screws on the bottom of the fork, which will be somewhere near the axle. Could be on the front or side, sometimes, or even in the bottom, like this one is, a little screw on the bottom there. And if you got a Ducati, a lot of times they're in the bottom, and Ducati put a little hole in the axle so you get a screwdriver up in here that the guy at the shop forgot to line up. Be aware of that? Okay, so adjusters at the top, rebound, adjusters at the bottom, compression. Remember, the stiffer the spring is, the more energy it's going to store and release, and the more damping I potentially need to control it. Now, this particular fork picture, this example has an external preload adjuster. The blue nut underneath that screw, you put a wrench on that and crank it down, and there's a threaded mechanism there that pushes on the spring to adjust the preload. Now, shock absorbers, we have the same basic adjusters, but just to make sure you're aggravated, intimidated, and somewhat pissed off, they're backwards. On a shock absorber, the adjuster at the bottom will be the rebound damping adjuster, and the adjusters at the top will be compression. And you're saying, well, that's fine, Matt, but how do I know which is top and bottom on my shock? Okay, if the shock has a reservoir like this one does, the reservoir will be at the top. But not all shocks have reservoirs, a lot of them don't. If there is no reservoir present, the body of the shock absorber is considered the top, and the shaft is considered the bottom. Now, I bring this up because shocks can be mounted upside down. This particular example was a race tech shock for a Honda ST1100, big touring bike. And for ease of access, and because we've added a reservoir that the stock shock doesn't have, we mount this particular shock upside down. So you need to be aware of the orientation of it. We call these adjusters clickers, by the way, because in most cases, when you make a movement, there's a little notch, a little click. And that's how you count your setting. That's how you know how much you moved it and where it's set. So if the magazine test on the XYZ 1000 said, we dialed in the XYZ 1000 suspension, and we found that the compression adjuster is set to 8 clicks, and the rebound adjuster set to 12 clicks, it worked great. They're talking about the number of clicks out from all the way in. Right C, tight C, left U, C. So counting the clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8. Okay, that's how many clicks it was. By the way, they don't always stop on a full click. Don't count a partial click. When they stop moving them. It's a fairly delicate mechanism. You can jam these things up. So that's your clickers. And by the way, some of them don't have clicks. Some of them are just turns of screws. So you count them a quarter turn, half turn, so on and so forth, increments. But always count it from turns out. So you're thinking to yourself, well, this is all nice information, but what am I going to do with this? Well, folks, it's a statistical fact. 80 to 90% of motorcycles sold with adjustable suspension, when they get traded in for a new model, guess where the suspension adjusters are? Yeah, where the factory put them, okay? So in other words, you're paying for something and you're not taking advantage of it or using of it because you're scared of it. So think about it this way. If you got a map, if you know where you started, you can always go back, right? So the first thing to do when you want to start adjusting and tuning your suspension is to figure out where you're at. When you measure that sag, you want to write down all those numbers. What was the initial sag? Or its initial measurement? What was the secondary measurement? What was the initial sag? What'd you end up with? How much preload did it take? Write it all down. Keep record of it. In the owner's manual, in the service manual, a little notebook you can carry with you. Same thing with your clickers. Figure out where they're all set. Run them all in and count the clicks and then put them back where you started from. Okay, now you know where you're at. You got it all written down. You got a record of it. Now, go to a piece of road you're familiar with, a section of trail or a riding area, ride regularly. And ride the bike, paying attention to the suspension. Ride it briskly. Don't try to be racer boy or nothing, but ride briskly enough to get the suspension working and focus on it. And how's it working? Watch it if you can. Is it moving all the way through the travel? Am I bottoming out? Okay. Does it move too fast? Do I need more compression damping? Or does it move too slow? Do I need less? How does it feel after the bump? Is it bouncy? Is it oscillating afterwards? How does it feel as I transition through the corners? Is it loose and vague? I need more rebound damping. Adjust one type of damping at a time. Adjust in small increments, 2 or 3 clicks or a quarter turn on the screw at a time, and record every adjustment you make. Then move on to the next one. Move on to compression. Start at the forks, work back to the shock. Okay? Do it one step at a time and work on it. If you make an adjustment and it works better, keep going. If you make an adjustment and it works worse, no shame. Now you know what doesn't work. Go the other direction. Okay, we were running that suspension tuner. Sometimes it's educated guess. Well, I think we need to do this. Well, that wasn't it. Okay, now we know what not to do. All right, so it's the end of the day. One of two things has happened. Either it works a whole lot better and you're all excited and happy with yourself because your bike rides way better than it ever did, or it works like crap. Okay? It works like crap, you're frustrated, but that's okay. Get out your notes, put it back where it was. Nothing ventured, nothing gained here, folks. The risk equals the reward. If you know where you started, you got no fear because you can always go back to that point. Now, how do these things actually work? What's going on inside the suspension when it's working, when I hit a bump? What I have pictured here for you is a cutaway view of what we call a damping rod fork. And that's what I've been carrying around up here with me. And damping rod forks are very, very common. Yeah, they've been around forever, like since the 50s. But they're very common today. A lot of trail bikes, a lot of cruiser bikes, even some of the touring bikes have them. We call it a damping rod fork because the red rod at the bottom here is going to control the oil flow through these holes at the bottom called compression holes. I'll show you how that works. The green stripe is my spring. So imagine a spring cut in half. That's why I got the little stripes here. Notice there's my preload spacer in between the fork cap and the spring, setting a preload. The yellow gold area here is oil, and the gray area above it is air. So it's critical. I got to leave an airspace inside this fork. Reason being, oil is incompressible. Air is compressible. So when I hit a bump and this thing compresses, the chrome tube is going down into the slider. It's taking up space. Oil's got to move to allow for that, and if I don't leave adequate airspace, I'll have problems. Also, just a little interesting note for you, air is compressible. It's called Boyle's Law. Google it later on, it's kind of interesting. But the airspace we leave is actually a tuning variable that you can use to your advantage. So what happens when the suspension works? When I hit a bump, slider's moving up, the fork inside's getting smaller, the oil is being forced through the large compression holes at the bottom of the damping rod into the top of the fork. There is some oil moving through this small hole at the top, but that's not really having any effect. It's just moving it. So these holes at the bottom of the damping rod are what's controlling our oil flow when we hit a bump. After the bump, and it's re-extending, the oil is backflowing through those compression holes at the bottom, but there's no real damping control going on here. It's just a pathway for the oil to return. There's a small check valve at the bottom of the chrome tube here that closes. And that, in conjunction with this little blue sealing ring on top of the damping rod, seals this chamber in the middle. And so the small hole at the top of the damping rod is your rebound damping control. Notice how that plays into where our clicker adjusters were. Compression at the bottom, rebound at the top, compression at the bottom, rebound at the top. All right? So that's it. Real simple design, very easy to work on, inexpensive to manufacture, but it's kind of limited because my control was done by holes. Certain number, 2, 4, 6, whatever the manufacturer put there, a certain size, never changes, does it? But wait a minute, don't bumps come in all different sizes? Yeah, kind of a problem, right? What happens? Well, typically, if I hit a small bump, the fork isn't moving very fast, and the oil flows too quickly through the holes, and I get a vague, mushy, squishy kind of a feeling, not much damping. But when I hit a big bump, and it's got to move real far, real fast, now the holes are too small, the oil can't flow quickly enough, and I get momentary fluid lock. That's your harshness, that's the hit, the jar that you feel through the front end when you go over a bump. Wouldn't it be really cool if those holes automatically got bigger or smaller based on the size of the bump I hit? That'd be about perfect, wouldn't it? Pretty much solve my problems. We have a product we call the Cartridge emulator at Racetech. We call it the Cartridge emulator because we're trying to emulate the damping characteristics of a more sophisticated cartridge fork I'll show you next. But this simple device is a check valve. It sits on top of the damping rod. The fork spring holds it in place. We drill out the compression holes at the bottom of the damping rod. We add some and make the ones that are there bigger so they no longer have any effect on oil. It's just a pathway. This is a dual stage device. There's a small bypass hole or series of holes at the top and a spring-loaded valve. So the way it works, when I hit a bump, the oil flows through these small bypass ports at the top, and we control the size and number. I can run 2 or 4 of them, and I can change the size of the holes. So now I got a small hole for a small bump. When I hit a larger bump, the oil pressure blows the spring-loaded valve open as far and fast as it needs to based on the size and shape of the bump. I can adjust that by virtue of the spring tension on that valve or by using different springs on the valve. We offer several different springs. So this thing's almost infinitely adjustable. So what kind of ride are you looking for? What kind of bike is it? It can be set up to deal with it and easily adjusted afterwards by simply taking the valve out through the top of the fork, twisting that screw, put it back in there. Not that hard, not that long. So took my single stage damping to a dual stage damping and made it adjustable. I have also now separated compression and rebound damping from each other. So if I need to use a different oil viscosity to deal with my spring rate, I can tune a gold valve to adjust it without making the fork too stiff. All right. The rebound stroke works exactly like it worked before. We didn't make any change there, and we're using the oil viscosity to control the rebound. So the whole exercise of the gold valve emulator is we're trying to give you the same quality and type of damping as what's found in a cartridge fork. Now, cartridge forks are more modern design. This is what you're going to find on most of your sport bikes, a lot of your sport touring bikes, a variation of this on motocross bikes. And they come in a couple different styles. Now, what I have pictured here is what we call a conventional fork. At Racetech, we refer to a conventional fork as one with a chrome tube at top, and an inverted fork or upside down fork, like on the Versus here, with the chrome tube at the bottom. Now, irregardless of whether it's conventional or inverted, it's just like people. The insides are all the same. So we all look different on the outside. We all got the same guts, right? It all works the same way. You got it. I can show you the cartridge damper mechanisms from two forks. You couldn't tell them apart. They look just the same. They work just the same. Now look how much more sophisticated this is, that damping rod fork. You know, pretty fancy looking stuff here. This is a detail of the compression unit at the bottom and the rebound unit at the top. It's attached to the fork cap via this rod. So again, compression on the bottom, rebound on the top. And this setup gives us that variable size hole we're looking for. So this is just a close-up of just those two valve mechanisms right beside each other so you can see the oil moving through them. So what I have here is a small bump. I'm hitting up a small bump on compression. What's happening? Well, on a rebound valve, there's nothing happening. Oil's bypassing it through this little check valve. No damping, just a bypass. The control is through the compression valve through the middle, the small passageway. And this example is using the clicker adjuster. So if you wondered how those clickers worked, well, look at it. You can look at this one and see it a little bit more clearly. It's what we call a tapered needle. Just about exactly like the fuel mixture shoe on a carburetor. So what happens? It's tapered, so when you're running inwards, it's making the opening smaller. When you back it outwards, it's making the hole bigger. And that's how that's working. Now you're saying to yourself, well, that's cool, Matt, but you know, mine doesn't have any clickers on it. That's okay. It works the same way. We just can't fine-tune that adjustment. When I hit a larger bump, yes, oil is still flowing through the middle passageway as before, but now it's moving to this port on the side and bending these little washer things open here. These washers are referred to as shims. They're wafer-thin spring steel designed to flex back and forth over and over and over again. They come in different thicknesses. They come in different diameters. The way we stack them up on top of each other is going to control the opening and closing characteristics of this valve, and that's what we call your valving. So if one of your riding buddies has said, I had my forks revalved, what he's referring to is the suspension tuner changed the size, number, orientation, or whatever of these valve shims to change the way the valve opens and closes to suit that rider style. Now, a good tuner won't just change the shims because there's some inherent limitations in the stock mechanism from the factory. Ideally, they'll use a Racetech Gold valve or other similar product on the market, change the entire valve mechanism to give you ultimate flexibility. So what do we have here? Well, we have a two-stage variable-sized hole, don't we? Small hole for small bumps, large hole for large bumps, and it's easily adjustable. The re-extension or rebound after the bump is working pretty much the same way. The whole thing just flip-flops the other valve. So it's everything I described to you, it's just changed. Now nothing happening here, and the same process has moved up to the rebound valve. So the beauty of this system is that I have separated rebound and compression damping from each other. They're independently tunable and adjustable, and I have a variable sized hole for my situation. So that's your basics on fork operation. Once you understand fork, shocks are pretty easy. Now there are a number of different shock absorber designs, and for the most part they work the same. The first picture I have here is called a twin tube shock absorber. These have been around for a while, since the 70s. They're still in use a little bit today. And you look at that, and doesn't that look almost exactly like the cartridge fork we just discussed? You would be correct. It works exactly like the cartridge fork we just discussed. Same way. Matter of fact, that's where the cartridge fork design originated. Now, these other style shock absorbers I have here are called a decarbon style shock absorber. And note, they only have one damper. So the primary difference here is instead of two dampers, each that only works in one direction, I now have one damper, and it works in two directions by the same process. First one here I call an emulsion shock, because the oil and the nitrogen gas are mixed together. My reservoir style shocks, I'm separating the nitrogen and the oil from each other, either by virtue of a metal piston or a rubber bladder. Now, just like my fork, where I'd leave some airspace in there, I gotta have a space inside the component, because when I hit a bump, the shaft is gonna go inside the body, it's gonna take up space, okay? When that happens, it either squeezes the oil and the nitrogen here, or in the case of the reservoir shocks, it moves the piston down against the nitrogen, or squeezes the bladder like a balloon. Now, the nitrogen is under very high pressure, anywhere from 1 to 300 pounds per square inch, depending on the application. We need a lot of pressure inside the shock to keep it from what we call cavitating, getting air bubbles in it. But does anybody understand or know why it is we're using nitrogen in a shock absorber as opposed to air? Anybody know? No! Air's free. We can charge you for nitrogen, buddy. It's America. Seriously. There's legitimate reasons for using nitrogen. It is more temperature stable. And hey folks, a motocross shock or road racing, it gets hot. Okay? You take a motocross bike, come off a track, put your hand against the shock absorber, you'll get a 3rd-degree burn. It gets way hot. Now forks don't get very hot. Okay, so you don't have a nitrogen issue in forks like you do shocks. Additionally, nitrogen is drier. Okay, so in other words, it doesn't absorb moisture, so you don't get corrosion issues. And that's the reason we use nitrogen. But let me let you in a little secret. Everybody, take a deep breath. Come on, everybody together. Breathe in. Okay, breathe out. Congratulations, you just inhaled 79% nitrogen. Our atmosphere is 79% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and 1% everything else. Point being, I could put air in your shock, you couldn't tell the difference. I could put air in Nicky Hayden's shock, and he probably couldn't tell the difference, at least short term. Okay, but we do use nitrogen. It's under real high pressure, so a couple things to consider. Don't try to check your nitrogen pressure. This is a wives' tale, a myth, that the nitrogen pressure affects how stiff your suspension is. Okay, I could change it from 100 to 300. You go ride the bike, you ain't gonna tell a difference. Okay, but if you put your pressure gauge up against that little valve there, it's gonna go, blow the guts across the shop, and it'll be a little tank. Psh, and now you gotta give me $50 to put nitrogen back in your shock. Okay, take special tools to set it and put it in there. Okay, high pressure, separate it from the oil if we can, and that's why your reservoir shocks work better. If I can separate the nitrogen and the oil and keep them apart, it works much, much better, more consistent performance over a wider range of operating conditions, and of course more volume. The more oil I can run in volume, the more nitrogen I can run in volume, the better things are going to work, generally speaking. This is a close-up detail of the damper mechanism. Works exactly like I described to you before. I just literally have one damper that flows in 2 directions as opposed to 2 dampers flowing in one. It's a call out of your major parts on the shock absorber. So note the adjuster positions. Low speed adjuster for rebound on the bottom. Okay, compression damping adjuster on the top of the shock. But let's back up here just for a second and watch out. Oops, wrong way. This one's upside down, isn't it? Okay, note the orientation, shock body, shaft. So this is actually a rebound damping adjuster here. So be careful, make sure you know which way the shock is pointing. So if this was interesting to you and you want to learn more about how your suspension works, all my images in this presentation is based on the Racetech Suspension Bible. It's 250 pages. We just released this. It's based on the training we do. It's a 1-week class we do at Racetech. And folks, it's written for the enthusiasts like you. You don't have to be an engineer or mechanic to understand this book. I was a technical trainer for years, and I'm here to tell you the pictures in this book are worth the $35. Just to see the stuff and understand what's in there and what's going on. It covers everything, how it works, why it works, how to take it apart, rebuild it, service it, tune it, adjust it. Chassis geometry, testing and troubleshooting. It's very thorough. Got them at the Racetech booth, 220, right down the side over here if you'd like to check it out. Again, if you got more questions about how suspension operates, your bike specifically, come down to booth 2020, or we're happy to answer your questions. We're here all weekend, and I really appreciate taking time out of your schedule to visit with me. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend. Thank you.